The year is 1077. The location is a fortress high in the Italian Alps Canosa. Outside its gates in the dead of winter, a man stands barefoot in the snow. He has been here for 3 days. His clothes are the rough, simple garments of a penitent, but this is no simple man. This is Henry IV, Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful secular ruler in all of Christendom, successor to Charlemagne and the Caesars of old. He is shivering, humiliated, and begging for an audience with the man inside the castle. And the man who makes him wait, not another emperor, not a king with a greater army. It is a pope. Gregory VII, the son of a blacksmith who now holds the emperor of the world hostage with a single devastating spiritual weapon, excommunication. How did this happen? How did a religious leader, the head of a faith that began in the dusty backwaters of the Roman Empire, gain the power to bring a mighty emperor to his knees? This scene, this singular moment of a king freezing in the snow, is the climax of a story 1,000 years in the making. It is a story about the collision of two of the most powerful ideas in human history, the power of the sword and the power of the spirit, the authority of the state and the authority of God. This is not just a medieval tale of popes and kings. This is the origin story of the Western world. The epic struggle that unfolded between the cross and the crown would draw the map of modern Europe. It would create the very concept of national sovereignty, and it would embed a fundamental, revolutionary idea into our political DNA. The idea that there is a moral authority to which even the most powerful rulers must answer. It is the story of how an emperor's desperate gamble to save a crumbling empire created a rival power that would one day challenge his successors for control of the world. It's a story of visionaries, zealots, forgers, and warriors. It's a story of how a single decision, made by one man on the eve of a battle, echoed down the centuries, culminating in this unbelievable moment at Canosa. Over the next hour, we will trace this incredible chain of events. We will start in the chaos of a collapsing Roman Empire, where an ambitious general named Constantine sees a symbol in the sky and changes the course of history forever. We will witness the birth of the papacy as a political force, rising from the ashes of Rome to become a new kind of empire, an empire of faith. We will meet the reformers who believed they were doing God's work by seizing earthly power, and the kings who saw them as dangerous fanatics threatening the very order of their world. And we will stand with Henry at Canosa to understand the impossible choice he faced. This is a story that reveals that the line between church and state is not a neat, clean line drawn on a piece of paper. It is a trench dug and redug over 1,000 years of conflict, stained with the blood of armies and the ink of treaties. To understand this struggle is to understand why our world is the way it is, why we separate religious and political power, why nations guard their sovereignty so fiercely, and why the question of ultimate authority, who gets to decide, remains the most volatile and important question we can ask. So let's begin. Let's go back to where it all started, to a dying empire and the ambitious man who would bet its future on a new and powerful god. Constantine the Great, a name that echoes with power. But in the early 4th century, he was just one of several rivals fighting for the scraps of a Roman empire that was tearing itself apart. The 3rd century had been a nightmare of plague, civil war, and economic collapse. The old gods, the pantheon of Jupiter, Mars, and Juno, seemed to have abandoned the Romans. Their rituals felt hollow, their promises empty. In this void, a new faith was spreading like wildfire. It was an Eastern mystery cult centered on a Jewish carpenter who was executed as a criminal: Christianity. To the Roman authorities, it was a dangerous and subversive ideology. Christians refused to make the token sacrifice to the emperor's divine spirit, an act the Romans saw not as religious but as a basic pledge of political loyalty. Their stubborn monotheism was seen as atheism, a rejection of the gods who protected the state. And their talk of a kingdom of heaven sounded like treason. They were persecuted sporadically but brutally, yet the more they were oppressed, the stronger they seemed to grow. Their message of salvation, of equality in the eyes of God, resonated with the poor, the enslaved, and the forgotten. Their tight-knit communities provided a social safety net in a crumbling world. By Constantine's time, they were a significant, organized, and dedicated minority across the empire. Constantine was a pragmatist, a brilliant general, and a man who understood power. He saw the rot in the old pagan system. He also saw the strength, the discipline, and the incredible organization of the Christians. He was marching on Rome in 312 CE to face his rival, Maxentius, in a final battle for control of the Western Empire. The odds were against him. The night before the battle at the Milvian Bridge just outside Rome, he looked for a sign, for any divine advantage he could get. What happened next is one of history's most pivotal and debated moments. Was it a genuine miracle, a solar phenomenon, or the brilliant propaganda of a master politician who knew he needed to inspire his troops and appeal to a powerful new demographic? We will never know for sure. What we do know is what Constantine did. He ordered his soldiers to paint the Christian symbol, the Chi-Rho, on their shields. The next day, they smashed the forces of Maxentius. Constantine marched into Rome as the undisputed master of the West, and he believed, or at least he claimed to believe, that the Christian God had given him the victory. The fate of the world had just turned on a dime. Constantine's victory was not the end of the story, it was the beginning of a profound and irreversible transformation. In 313 CE, he met with his eastern counterpart, Licinius, and together they issued the Edict of Milan. This was not a decree that made Christianity the state religion. Not yet. But it did something arguably more important, it legalized it. After centuries of hiding in catacombs and fearing the midnight knock on the door, Christians were granted full freedom of worship. Their confiscated property was returned. The power of the Roman state would no longer be used to crush them, it would now be used to protect them. This was a revolution. Overnight, the church went from an underground network to an imperially recognized institution. Money, land, and favors began to flow from the imperial treasury. Bishops, once hunted by local governors, now became important public figures, advisors to the powerful. Constantine himself poured immense sums into building magnificent churches, like the Basilica of St. Peter in Rome, on the very spot where the apostle was believed to have been martyred. He was investing in the infrastructure of a new spiritual empire. But with imperial favor came imperial interference. Constantine saw the church as a tool for unity, a spiritual glue to hold his fractured empire together, but he quickly discovered that the Christians, far from being a monolithic bloc, were fiercely divided by theological disputes. Debates over the very nature of God and Christ, particularly the Arian controversy, which questioned whether Jesus was truly divine or a created being, threatened to tear the church apart. For Constantine, this was not just a religious problem, it was a political crisis. A divided church could not unify his empire. So in 325 CE, he did something no emperor had ever done before. He summoned over 300 bishops from across the empire to the city of Nicaea. This was the first great ecumenical council, and who presided over it, not a bishop, but the emperor himself. Constantine, who was not even baptized yet, sat on a golden throne, mediating debates on the fundamental nature of the Holy Trinity. It was a stunning display of imperial power merging with religious authority. The council produced the Nicene Creed, a foundational statement of Christian orthodoxy that is still recited in churches today. And in doing so, it established a momentous precedent. The emperor was not just the protector of the church, but also its ultimate arbiter and enforcer. The state now had a vested interest in defining correct belief. The line between heresy and treason began to blur. Constantine's legacy was complex. He built a new capital for his Christian empire, Constantinople, shifting the center of gravity eastward. He continued to use pagan symbols on his coins and was only baptized on his deathbed. Was he a true convert or a master political strategist? The answer is likely both. He saw the future and he hitched the Roman eagle to the Christian cross. But the process he started soon took on a life of its own. Less than 50 years after his death, in 380 CE, another emperor, Theodosius I, took the final, fateful step. He issued the Edict of Thessalonica, which declared Nicene Christianity to be the one and only official state religion of the Roman Empire. All other faiths, including the ancient Roman pagan traditions and non-Orthodox Christian sects, were outlawed. Temples were closed, their treasures seized. The persecuted had become the establishment. And now, armed with the full power of the law, they sometimes became the persecutors. The church was now inextricably woven into the fabric of the state. It adopted the empire's administrative structure, with dioceses and provinces ruled by bishops and archbishops. Its law, canon law, became a powerful legal system governing everything from marriage to inheritance. It was wealthy, it was organized, and it was the official spiritual arm of the most powerful empire the world had ever known. On the surface, it seemed that the church and the empire were fused into a perfect, unshakable union. But a storm was gathering on the horizon. The Roman Empire, for all its power, was a fragile giant. In the West, its foundations were cracking. Barbarian tribes, Goths, Vandals, Franks pressed against the frontiers, the economy faltered. The political will to govern the vast, unwieldy territory was draining away. In 410 CE, the unthinkable happened. The city of Rome itself was sacked by the Visigoths. And in 476 CE, the last Roman emperor in the West, a young boy ironically named Romulus Augustulus, was quietly deposed. The Western Roman Empire did not fall with a bang, it simply ceased to be. Centuries of centralized authority vanished. The roads fell into disrepair, the great aqueducts crumbled. The Roman legions, which had guaranteed order for half a millennium, were gone. Europe descended into a period of chaos, violence, and fragmentation. This was the power vacuum, and into this vacuum, one institution remained. It was the only body that still had an organized, continent-wide structure. It was the only source of learning and literacy in a world of warlords. And its leader, based in the once mighty city of Rome, was the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. While kings and kingdoms rose and fell, the Church endured. And the popes, sitting in the ruins of an old empire, began to realize that they were the heirs to its legacy. They inherited its claim to universality, its administrative genius, and its ambition. Everything still looked like chaos on the surface, but small cracks in the old order were giving way to the foundations of a new one. A spiritual power was about to become a temporal one, and the world would never be the same. In the centuries that followed the fall of Rome, the Bishop of Rome evolved from a major spiritual leader into a formidable political player. Popes like Gregory the Great in the late 6th century took on the day-to-day governance of the city of Rome, negotiating treaties with Lombard invaders, organizing food supplies, and managing the vast agricultural estates the church had acquired. They were becoming princes in their own right, rulers of a fledgling state in central Italy. But they faced a constant threat. They were surrounded by hostile powers, and unlike the Byzantine emperor in faraway Constantinople, they had no armies of their own. They needed a protector, a strong sword arm to defend the church. They found it in a rising and ambitious Germanic tribe to the north, the Franks. The alliance between the papacy and the Frankish kings would become one of the most important partnerships in European history. The Franks gave the Pope military protection. The Pope gave the Franks spiritual legitimacy, anointing them as God's chosen rulers. This symbiotic relationship reached its stunning apex on Christmas Day in the year 800. The Frankish king, a towering and brilliant warrior named Charlemagne, was kneeling in prayer at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. As he rose, Pope Leo III suddenly placed a crown on his head and declared him Imperator Romanorum, Emperor of the Romans. The crowd roared its approval. A Roman emperor was once again crowned in the West for the first time in over 300 years. But this was a new kind of empire, a Holy Roman Empire, and look closely at the scene. It was a brilliant and audacious political statement by the Pope. Charlemagne may have been surprised, perhaps even annoyed. But the symbolism was unmistakable. The emperor did not seize the crown for himself. The crown was given to him by the Pope. The ultimate secular authority on earth was conferred by the ultimate spiritual authority. Pope Leo had just claimed that the power of his office was superior to the power of the throne. It was a claim that lay dormant for a time, but it contained the seeds of 1,000 years of conflict. As the papacy's ambition grew, so did its need for a legal and historical justification for its claims to earthly power. And in the shadowy scriptoriums of the 8th or 9th century, one of the most audacious and successful forgeries in all of history was created: the donation of Constantine. This document purported to be a legal decree from the first Christian emperor, Constantine the Great. In it, the grateful emperor, supposedly cured of leprosy by Pope Sylvester I, declared that he was ceding all temporal authority over Rome, Italy, and the entire Western Roman Empire to the Pope. He was effectively making the Pope his imperial successor in the West. It was, of course, a complete fabrication, but in an age of limited literacy and uncritical belief, it became a cornerstone of papal propaganda. For centuries, it was cited as irrefutable proof that the papacy was not just a spiritual power, but the rightful political ruler of Western Europe. It was a legal weapon, waiting for a pope bold enough to wield it with full force. That pope arrived in the 11th century. The church at this time was in a sorry state. It was plagued by corruption. The practice of simony, the buying and selling of church offices, was rampant. Clerical marriage was common despite rules of celibacy, and most damaging of all in the eyes of reformers was the practice of lay investiture. For centuries, kings and emperors had controlled the appointment of bishops and abbots in their own lands. They would invest them with the symbols of their office, the ring, and the staff. To the rulers, this was a political necessity. Bishops were not just priests, they were powerful feudal lords who controlled vast lands, immense wealth, and even armies. An emperor like Henry IV of the Holy Roman Empire simply could not rule his fragmented German and Italian territories without the loyalty of these prince-bishops, whom he appointed and treated as key administrators of his realm. But to a new generation of zealous reformers, this was an abomination. It made the church beholden to secular masters. It filled the ranks of the clergy with political appointees, not holy men. This reform movement, which began in the monastery of Cluny in France, called for libertas ecclesiae, the freedom of the church. They wanted a church purified of worldly influence, answerable only to God, and led by a supreme and absolute pontiff in Rome. In 1073, the most radical and determined of these reformers was elected pope. He took the name Gregory VII. Gregory was a true believer, an iron-willed ideologue who saw himself as Christ's vicar on earth, tasked with establishing a divine order. He believed passionately that the spiritual power was to the temporal power as the sun is to the moon. One shines with its own light, the other with reflected light. To him, the pope was the sun. In 1075, he dropped a bombshell on the political world of Europe. He issued a decree called the Dictatus Papae, the dictates of the pope. It was a list of 27 blunt, uncompromising assertions of papal power. It claimed the pope had the sole right to appoint and depose bishops. It claimed he was judged by no one. And then came the most explosive claim of all, that the pope had the power to depose emperors. This was a declaration of war. It was a direct challenge to the very foundation of the medieval world order. And in the Imperial palace in Germany, Emperor Henry IV read it as such. Henry was a proud and stubborn ruler, fighting to hold his unruly empire together. He had been appointing bishops his entire life, just as his father and grandfather had before him. He saw Gregory not as a holy reformer, but as a power-mad fanatic trying to usurp his God-given authority. He refused to back down. He summoned a council of German bishops who dutifully declared that Gregory was a false monk and no longer pope. The immovable object had met the unstoppable force. The collision was about to shake Christendom to its core. Gregory's response was swift and devastating. In a solemn council at Rome, he did what no pope had dared to do for centuries. He excommunicated Henry IV. It is difficult for us today to grasp the sheer power of this act. Excommunication was the spiritual equivalent of a nuclear weapon. It cast Henry out of the church, denying him the sacraments and damning his soul to hell. But its effects were brutally political. It dissolved the sacred oaths of fealty that bound Henry's subjects to him. Every duke, every prince, every knight in his empire was now legally free to rebel against him, and rebel they did. The German nobles, who had long resented Henry's attempts to centralize power, seized their chance. They declared that if Henry did not have the excommunication lifted within a year and a day, they would elect a new emperor. Henry's empire crumbled around him, his armies deserted him, his allies abandoned him. He was isolated, desperate, and facing the complete loss of his throne. He had tried to fight the Pope with the sword, and he had lost. Now only one path remained: submission. He had to seek the Pope's forgiveness personally. In the dead of winter, in January of 1077, Henry made one of the most dramatic journeys in history. He, his wife, and their young son crossed the treacherous, snow-covered Alps. It was a brutal and dangerous passage. When he finally reached Italy, he learned that Pope Gregory was not in Rome, but was staying at the mountain fortress of Canosa, under the protection of the powerful Countess Matilda of Tuscany. Henry made his way to the castle. He was not coming as an emperor with an army, but as a sinner seeking absolution. And so we return to our opening scene. On January 25th, Henry presented himself at the gates of Canosa. He was forced to leave his royal entourage behind. He wore the simple, scratchy wool tunic of a penitent, and he was barefoot. The castle gates remained closed. Gregory inside refused to see him. For one day, Henry stood in the snow, fasting, shivering. A second day passed, the same. A third day, the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, the most powerful man in the secular world, was being subjected to the ultimate ritual of public humiliation. Inside the castle, Gregory was in a bind. As a priest, his Christian duty was clear. If a sinner shows true repentance, he must grant forgiveness. But as a political leader, he knew that forgiving Henry would restore his authority and allow him to crush the German rebellion that the Pope himself had encouraged. His advisors begged him to show mercy. Finally, on the third day, Gregory relented. the gates were opened, a weeping Henry was brought before him, and the Pope lifted the sentence of excommunication. Henry had his crown back, but at what cost? He had publicly admitted that the Pope had the authority to judge, to condemn, and to forgive an emperor. The image of the barefoot king in the snow was a propaganda victory for the papacy of unimaginable proportions. It seared into the European consciousness the idea of a spiritual authority that stood above the temporal one. The world had changed. The struggle, of course, was far from over. A forgiven Henry would later march on Rome and drive Gregory into exile, where he died uttering the bitter words, "I have loved righteousness and hated iniquity, therefore I die in exile." The investiture controversy would drag on for another 4 decades, until a compromise was finally reached in 1122 with the Concordat of Worms. This agreement split the difference. The church would elect bishops and invest them with their spiritual symbols, but the emperor had the right to be present and to grant them their lands and secular rights. It was a messy, pragmatic solution that essentially recognized a separation of spheres. A dual authority was now formally enshrined in the political structure of Europe, but the ghost of Canosa would haunt the relationship between popes and kings for centuries to come. The papacy had demonstrated its power, and it would not forget it. The drama at Canosa was not an end, but the beginning of a new chapter in the struggle for power. In the century and a half that followed, the papacy reached the zenith of its temporal authority. Popes like Innocent III in the early 13th century acted as the arbiters of Europe. They commanded kings, launched crusades to the Holy Land, and governed through a sophisticated legal bureaucracy, the Roman Curia, that made the Church the most advanced state in Europe. They had successfully built what historians call the papal monarchy, a spiritual and political powerhouse that claimed universal jurisdiction over all of Christendom. The dream of Gregory VII seemed to have been realized. However, the immediate political consequences of the investiture controversy were complex, and for some, catastrophic. The long struggle had profoundly weakened the Holy Roman Emperor. While the emperor was distracted fighting the Pope, the powerful German princes consolidated their own local power, seizing lands and rights from the crown. Unlike in France or England, where monarchs were slowly but surely centralizing their authority, the conflict left the empire fragmented. Germany and Italy would not be unified into single nation-states for another 700 years, a legacy of this medieval power struggle. This points to one of the great ironies of the story. The papacy's victory over its universal rival, the Holy Roman Emperor, inadvertently paved the way for the rise of its next and far more dangerous set of rivals, the national monarchs. Kings in France, England, and elsewhere watched the conflict between Pope and Emperor and learned valuable lessons. They worked to create their own strong, centralized states, developing their own systems of taxation, their own royal courts, and their own sense of national identity that was not dependent on either pope or emperor. The ultimate showdown came at the turn of the 14th century. The King of France was Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair. He was a ruthless, efficient, and deeply pious man who was determined to make France the supreme power in Europe. To fund his wars against England, he decided to do something that had long been forbidden. He imposed a tax on the French clergy. Pope Boniface VIII, an arrogant and brilliant lawyer who held the most extreme views of papal supremacy, was outraged. He issued a papal bull forbidding any secular ruler from taxing the clergy without papal consent. Philip retaliated by forbidding the export of gold and silver from France, cutting off a major source of the Pope's revenue. The conflict escalated, with Boniface issuing ever more grandiose claims of papal power, culminating in the famous bull Unum Sanctam, which declared that it is absolutely necessary for salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman pontiff. Philip's response was not to debate theology. It was to use brute force. In 1303, his agents, allied with an Italian noble family, stormed the papal palace at Anagni. They broke into the Pope's chambers and physically assaulted the 86-year-old Boniface, slapping him and holding him prisoner for 3 days. The crime of Anagni was a shock to Christendom. The Pope, God's vicar on earth, had been manhandled by the thugs of a national king. He was rescued by locals but died of shock just a month later. The humiliation at Anagni was the bookend to the humiliation at Canosa. Where an emperor had once stood barefoot in the snow, a king had now sent his men to slap a pope. The balance of power had irrevocably shifted. 2 years later, a French cardinal was elected Pope Clement V. He never even made it to Rome. Under pressure from King Philip, he established the papal court in Avignon, a city in southern France. For the next 70 years, the popes would live in Avignon, effectively under the thumb of the French monarchy. This Babylonian captivity of the papacy, followed by the Great Western Schism where multiple rival popes excommunicated each other, shattered the moral authority and universal prestige of the office. The papacy's obsession with temporal power had led it into a political trap from which it would never fully recover its old supremacy. This decline in papal authority, this growing sense that the Church was corrupt and entangled in worldly politics, created the fertile ground for the next great upheaval in European history, the Protestant Reformation. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in 1517, he was attacking a papacy whose spiritual credibility had been eroding for centuries, in part due to the very political victories it had won. Rulers who wanted to seize church lands and end papal interference in their affairs now had a theological justification for doing so. Let us consider for a moment a different path. What if Henry IV had decisively defeated Gregory VII? What if the principle of lay investiture had been upheld and the emperor's control over the church solidified? Europe might have developed along a very different trajectory, one much closer to the Byzantine model in the East, where the emperor remained the supreme authority over both church and state. This system, often called Caesaropapism, created a powerful, unified state but allowed for little institutional space to challenge the ruler's authority on moral or spiritual grounds. The unique, messy, and violent conflict between Pope and Emperor in the West, for all its destruction, created a revolutionary concept, a dualism of power. It institutionalized the idea that society had two legitimate sources of authority, the spiritual and the temporal. And by fighting each other to a standstill, they inadvertently created a space for other forms of power to grow: cities, universities, and eventually the individual conscience. This enduring tension is the deep, foundational legacy of this thousand-year war. It is the reason our political world is built upon a constant, restless negotiation between power and principle. When we step back from the grand sweep of this thousand-year narrative, from Constantine's vision to Boniface's humiliation, several recurring historical patterns emerge, patterns that speak not just to the medieval world but to our own. These are timeless lessons about the nature of power, belief, and human ambition. First is the profound and often tragic relationship between power and purity. The Gregorian reform movement began with a noble and understandable goal: to free the Church from the corruption of secular politics, to create a libertas ecclesiae. Gregory VII and his allies saw themselves as spiritual purifiers. Yet in their quest to achieve this freedom, they found themselves drawn deeper and deeper into the very game of power politics they sought to escape. To fight an emperor, the papacy had to become a state itself. It needed its own laws, its own bureaucracy, its own diplomats, and its own sources of revenue. The papal monarchy, which was the ultimate outcome of the reforms, was in many ways a far more worldly and political institution than the one it had replaced. This reveals a timeless paradox. Institutions that gain immense power to enforce a particular vision of purity often end up being corrupted by the very power they sought. The tools you use to win a war end up shaping the peace you build. Second, this story is a testament to the astonishing power of ideas. The entire conflict revolved around an abstract question: from where does legitimate authority ultimately derive? Is it from God directly to the king, or from God through his representative on earth, the Pope? This was not just a debate for theologians. It was an idea for which armies marched, kings were deposed, and the map of Europe was redrawn. And consider the donation of Constantine. A document that was a complete and utter fiction, a lie, served as a foundational legal claim for the world's most powerful religious institution for over 700 years. It demonstrates that what people believe to be true can be just as powerful, if not more powerful, than what is actually true. Human reality is shaped by the stories we tell ourselves, and the institution that controls the dominant story holds the keys to the kingdom. Finally, we see the pattern of unintended consequences playing out on a millennial scale. Constantine legalized Christianity to unify his empire, but in doing so, he created a powerful, independent institution that would ultimately challenge the very idea of absolute imperial unity. Gregory VII sought to establish papal supremacy over all of Christendom, but his victory over the Holy Roman Emperor weakened the one universal power that could have checked the rise of national monarchies: who would prove to be far more effective enemies of papal authority. Each actor, pursuing a logical and understandable goal, set in motion a chain of events that led to an outcome they could never have predicted and might not have wanted. History is a river whose currents are often turned by the actions of people who have no idea where the water is ultimately heading. This forces us to ask some fundamental questions. How do we prevent our most cherished institutions from becoming obsessed with their own power and survival at the expense of their original mission? At what point does a deeply held belief system transform into a political ideology used to justify worldly ambition? And in any society, who gets the final say? Is there or should there be a moral authority that can hold raw political power in check? The medieval world offered one answer to that question, an answer forged in conflict, embodied by the struggle between pope and emperor. Our modern world offers another, often in the form of constitutions, international law, and human rights. But the underlying question remains the same. What happens when the law of the state conflicts with what we believe to be the moral law of the universe? The story of the cross and the crown does not give us an easy answer, but it shows us that this is one of the most important and enduring struggles in the human story. So, what have we seen on this epic journey? We have traveled from the banks of the Tiber River, where a Roman emperor gambled on a new god, to a snowy fortress in the Alps, where his successor begged for forgiveness from a pope. We have seen how this single act of imperial patronage created a new center of power in the world, one that would grow in the ruins of the Roman Empire to challenge the authority of kings and emperors for 1,000 years. This was more than a rivalry, it was a battle for the soul of civilization. It was a fight over the ultimate source of authority on Earth. The legacy of this conflict is all around us. It is in the very architecture of Western society, in the deep-seated belief that no single person or institution should have absolute, unchecked power. The constant grinding tension between the spiritual and the temporal, between the cross and the crown, created the political space where ideas of liberty, sovereignty, and individual rights could begin to grow. The modern world was not born from their agreement, but from their epic, century-spanning disagreement. This incredible story, of course, does not end here. The weakening of the papacy and the rise of powerful kings set the stage for the next great shattering of European unity. If you want to understand how a German monk named Martin Luther could successfully defy both pope and emperor, you first have to understand the centuries of conflict that came before. And if the story of a great empire, like that of Charlemagne, struggling to hold itself together fascinates you, you'll want to explore our upcoming episode on the final, dramatic fall of the Byzantine Empire in Constantinople. The echoes of Rome are everywhere. The long war between the papacy and the monarchs of Europe was a fight over who could claim to speak for God. But in the end, it was a profoundly human story, driven by ambition, faith, greed, and fear. It reminds us that the grand forces of history are always moved by the choices of individuals, standing at critical turning points, staring into an uncertain future. And it all began with a choice made by a single man on the banks of a river staring at the sun.